Okay, I think we can start. It's time. From what I heard, everything ran smoothly this morning in all three parallel small events. The same thing for 30 years now. In other words, boring. No revolutions, no complaints, nothing. I mean, very strange. I asked the people if there are any complaints. Maybe you have complaints, but not till now. Tell me when I'm absent. Now we're going to start on time. What I want to say, just follow up from this morning, the whole idea that started almost 40 years ago in Canada. I don't know if you know the all learned societies in Canada. They have small meetings, parallel meetings. And the whole idea is to have small parallel meetings organized along divisions and unions that we have. But if we want really to simulate what happened 2,500 years ago, the substance, the crux of the matter is here now, what we are doing now. Now, what we are doing actually, the other thing is to write off expenses, as I said this morning, and some people don't like when I say that, but I think 90% is true. You belong to the 10%. But the idea is to bring people, we call them wise people. In other words, it's another word saying they're old people. But it doesn't sound very politically correct to say that they're old people, like me. They are wise people. So these wise people, like in the ancient symposium, they can come together. We give them a subject, general, as it happened 2,500 years in downtown Athens. They gave them a subject. I'm not going to say the subject. They gave them a subject, and then everybody had to, from a different perspective, they had to deal with that subject. And of course, if you go back and read Plato's Symposium, you will see that the people that they were there, by the way, I'm the first one. I'm Phaedrus. Phaedrus was elected as the chair, as the coordinator. So he spoke only for 5 minutes. I think I'm going to speak less. Anyway, so they gave them the subject, the topic, and there were different approaches because, and there was an emergency, if you read it, there was an emergency during the meeting, and he solved the problem. There were some hiccups, and then he suggested the solution to this problem. So they used, and of course there were artists, there were philosophers. So usually we say philosophers now, but they were social scientists actually. That's why I have a sociology, because Aristotle, some people, they claim he was a social, of course, Plato, definitely he was a social scientist. There's no question about that. And some people think that he's the father of social science, maybe. We used to say in the high school, he was the father because he did something bad to the mother of social science, but that's a difference. And so I'll give the floor. Our first, I'm not going to read the topic, just a topic for marketing purposes. Actually, if you see, I think I have suggested titles. There were not titles, but if you see that column there, it's what I suggest as the title of the presentation. It's not actually. So I tried to make it, it's available, so you don't have to, even you don't have to cite my name, doesn't matter. You can use it as your own. It's very common in academia. So our first speaker is Professor Mandaloni. He has been, and actually we use these people. I don't like to say good words in front of them. I say bad words just in the back of them. But anyway, and he has been very instrumental in developing the sociology unit that we have. We organized 2 conferences, one social science, one sociology, and they've been very successful. And not only that, we published a journal, the Athens Journal of Social Science, and that's why we have a lot of Italians in those conferences. I don't know why. It's an Italian connection because he promotes in Italy. And now you have 9 minutes to impress the world, Professor Mandaloni.
I have measured my intervention. As a matter of fact, it will last no more than 9 minutes. Okay. My presentation relates to my talk relates to Italy, of course, the pandemic and post-pandemic in Italy. But it's well known that Italy was one of the first countries to be affected by the pandemic. Therefore, COVID-19 can be seen as a very important stress test for both the Italian health and welfare system and for the Italian political system. Well, in my talk, I will briefly summarize what happened during the pandemic from 2020 to 2022. And then I will try to discuss briefly what is happening now. We can say that in general, the Italian national health system has been able to cope with the health emergency, but with many differences from one region to another. Given the regional structure of the Italian institutional, which prevails since the 2001 constitutional reform, the national health system is divided into 21 regional systems, only vaguely coordinated by the Ministry of Health in Rome. The role of the public sector is still central in some of these systems, for instance in the region of Romagna, while in many other regions, such as Lombardy, the private sector, which is not prepared by vocation to deal with health emergencies, especially pandemics, has become increasingly important. This has caused significant differences in performance, sometimes to the detriment of more advanced regions, again like Lombardy, also had to absorb the first blow of the pandemic between February and March 2020. Southern Italian regions, whose health systems are severely underfunded, suffered a minor impact and thus performed well. In any case, regional imbalances were evident even in the context of general resilience of the public health system, which was able to benefit from substantial extraordinary funding during that period. As for the economic consequences, these were very serious and almost lethal. Sectors such as trade, tourism, that many businesses closed, many people remain unemployed. Well, as in many other countries, business associations initially opposed to the containment based on lockdown, but in the end they put on a good face, especially as the government pledged quite substantial sums to replace the income lost, forced closure of many crises and firms. The government did the same for people in unemployment and poverty through the new anti-poverty policy based on the so-called citizenship income, which is really, which was really a conditional income. The replacement of the central-left government with the so-called national coalition government in February 2021 did not change much in terms of policies to support businesses and workers. The overall effect was positive. After collapsing in 2020, the Italian economy recovered much of what it had lost as early as 2021, growing for a while more than Germany, for instance. And there was also a significant growth rate in 2022. All this should prompt the national political system, Italian national, to rethink the nature of health and welfare policies as well as economic growth. Launch of the European Union's plan for green and digital transition, sometimes named as Next Generation, for which Italy has been granted 209 billion aid and loans to be spent by 2026, is certainly an opportunity not only to reactivate the Italian economy, but also to make new public investments in the social field. It is an opportunity that comes not only at the end of the pandemic, but also after some 30 years of policies of marketization, privatization, public spending restraint, which are proven to be substantially ineffective in ensuring the reduction of the public deficit and the revival of economic growth. Since the pandemic demonstrated that public wealth is an indivisible collective good, many thought it should be better managed at the state level and through predominantly public channels. In terms of economic policy, many believe that the new wave of investment in the green and digital spread evenly across the country, would revive the Italian economy. However, despite good intentions in this regard, once the emergency ended, the national political system moved exactly in the opposite direction. Examples of this are the current reduction in funding for public health care and the further regionalization of the health, welfare, and education system. Another example is the weakening of income support policies for the poor and unemployed. Matter of today, the Italian government has licensed a new reform of these measures that tend to weaken these type of support measures. Other tightening of restrictions on migration flows from abroad. Finally, initial support for the ecological and digital transition has also weakened, partly because of the new emergency caused by the war between Russia and Ukraine and the sanctions imposed by NATO countries. Many commentators point to the link between the projected increase in military spending and the ever more severe cuts imposed on welfare and regional cohesion policies. It is therefore worth asking what factors underlie these trends in Italian politics. The initial push for national unity generated by the pandemic was quickly thwarted by two important factors at work since the 1990s, a deeper social and political. The first one is the disappearance of pro-labor parties. With the only partial exception of the Five-Star Movement and a small alliance between the Green and the Left, both currently in opposition, all other parties are strong defenders of neoliberal ideology, Italian style, and obvious carriers of corporate interests, Italian style. The second factor at play is the ever-active presence of the North-South cleavage on which the Northern League is positioned. Combination of these two factors results in policies of privatization of the economy, residualization of welfare, public health care, and further decentralization of the state powers to the benefit of the wealthiest regions. This orientation, which had already emerged with the so-called national unity government, Draghi government, from February 2021 to October 2022, was further strengthened with the Meloni government in office since last October, following the electoral victory of the right-wing coalition. So what now? The prevailing social and political climate in Italy is depressing, and unlike in France, seems to lead to passivity, with the usual exception of a few small active. The apparent lack of political alternatives pushes people with interests unrelated to those of the political, economic, financial establishment toward creating individualistic which to shelter from the coming storms. The most important example of this trend is the post-pandemic resumption of migration flows from Italy, which involves mostly young people and especially those with a high level of educational profession. Now I have to quote it myself. As I wrote a few years ago in a paper appeared in the Athens Journal of Social Science, this is an exit solution in Albert Ishmael's sense to the problem of the Italian crisis, which may offer the solution to individual problems of job placement or social mobility, but will not prevent the Italian political system from its march toward economic stagnation and perhaps also international irrelevance. Or maybe I'm wrong, or at least I hope so. Thank you.
I'm not surprised by Professor Mandaloni's ability to make great speeches because I know him for so long, so no surprises there. Our next speaker is again another important member of Atiner. She's the head of our health and sciences division, and after 500 years she will be remembered because of that role. All the other role will be disappear, and all these people here will be remembered as Plato Symposium because of their participation in that symposium. So I honor, he just came from yesterday, I think, from the United States, and you had a late flight. Okay, yeah. And Professor Vicky Hughes, you have 9 minutes to impress the world. I have a question though. All 5 minutes.
Hi, good afternoon. My perspective is coming more from a healthcare perspective than from the United States. In the 1990s, the United States made the decision to decrease. So our ICUs got smaller, our surgical units got smaller, and in our healthcare system, people went home earlier and sicker. And so the ones that were in the hospital were more intensive within more intensive treatment. So we were not prepared for a pandemic when it came. So what we did was we expanded to units where nurses were not used to that level. So all of a sudden we have med surg units that were taking care of critically ill, and we had nurses that were stretched outside of their comfort. Part of what happened in that scenario was that our nurses came back. So we had retired nurses that went and worked in our public health clinics, went and they volunteered to give instructions. They went and they volunteered to provide care to people, and they basically came on active duty working again in their 70s and 80s. So I want to talk a little bit about how it kind of changed our culture in America and how that led to some of the big things that we have. First of all, I think it's our training. When you go through public health, and we may have public health experts, when a pandemic is coming, the idea is that you keep the most vulnerable separated, and that the stage of herd immunity, right? You keep people protected. Once people start developing that immunity, then they're able to go back to work, and you ride out the pandemic, and ideally you avoid a lot of deaths that come from that. And so that was the model that we moved forward with. So while they locked certain people down, where teachers stayed home, where you have maybe financial people working from home, push the nurses into that. And part of what came from that experience had the largest death of nurses. So we had nurses that have worked 30 or 40 years that were actually dying. You hear a lot about the patients, but you don't hear about the death toll in the nurses. And I believe it was the death between your patients dying, which you had never seen before, and your colleagues dying, that made an increased impact of those nurses that were basically traumatized, those secondarily and because they worked. So there were certain groups, not just our nurses. Remember our truckers, they kept right on delivering food. Our farmers kept right on creating farm. Our stockers in our big hospital, our big department stores, our grocery stores, they kept working, many of them overtime, while other people stayed home. And so you had almost a two-world experience of what was going on in the pandemic. Part of the issues, I think, began to come when they did the recovery efforts, when they poured money into the. So if you died from COVID, they paid $20,000 more to that hospital. So in our system, it was skewed a little bit. If you had COVID, you died of COVID, right? Because the hospital got $20,000 more. So it kind of skewed the data, which I think really pushed out to the public this panic of the people that were dying. So I think that was one issue. The other is when they moved the money in, they moved it in a way to where it went to these travel agencies that were going to provide manpower. So we would have a regular nurse making $40 an hour. They would hire a nurse to come from somewhere else that would make $150 an hour, working side by side in the same place. The nurse that made $40 to $50 an hour had to do all the additional duties because it wasn't in the contract of the travel nurse. They had to orient the travel nurse. They had to show them where all the different items belonged. They had to teach them the policies and protocols. Often they had to supervise these nurses to get them competent. And so it created in the system a disparity on the price. And we actually had nurses leaving their job, going to work for a travel company, rolling in the next day to work at the hospital with less responsibility, making more money. And so today we still have that going through our system. There's a hospital in New York that currently spends $80 million a year on travel nurses because now we can't keep our nurses. They got angry, they got fed up, and many of them left And now for the first time, our enrollment in nurses has gone down, coming into our nursing. Never at Johns Hopkins not had nurses. Don't get me wrong, we still have plenty coming in, but the number of applicants is dropping. And so as we kind of think about this social system, the funding is still coming out. So right now we still have nurses. If you go to DC, they will pay you for an apartment for 3 months, and they will give you $80,000 and pay all expenses. So that has drained a certain pool 4 times the amount of money that I'm making to have this travel experience. So right now, we don't know what's going to happen when the money goes away, right? Will the nurses come back? On top of that, we currently have your average nurse is 50 years old, 5 years old. That's your experience level. Those are really the foundation of the people that are working. What happens when they retire? What's happening to the next generation? We have a huge issue where most of our new graduates only about something to a job that offers them. So at 18 months, the hospital has invested over $100,000 in training, and then they roll into a different profession. So this is part of that system of the pandemic that was motivated in part by the financial emphasis that our government placed, where they place the money. And nurses who had already had COVID, and particularly in New York, there's thousands of nurses that left because we know today that I'm not an anti-vax person. I advise for their vaccinations, what they need to, but we know that no vaccination is stronger or has a stronger effect than having had the disease, and that's how we were trained. There's a lot of that political strife on economy and feeling appreciated and the whole field of nursing. So I just wanted to open up. I don't know if I'm allowed, if you want to share any of your experiences.
Awesome. And thanks God you had a Greek Jew that helped with Pfizer, because the chief executive officer, maybe you don't know that he's from Thessaloniki of Pfizer, and he's Greek Jew. So we combine 2 cultures to produce vaccinations in the United States. That's a problem. But he was born here. He was raised here. He did his PhD here, and then he moved to US to work for Pfizer at a lower level. Then that shows the opportunity. And now he makes billions as a salary because of this taxation, taking a lot of money. Some people are doesn't do anything, just make money for Pfizer. Anyway, our next speaker, a distant land at a global crossroad. The topic is he here? Yeah. Wait, this? I mean, New Zealand is not distant. I mean, well, it's the world is round. So if it's very, if it's very far away, it's very close from the other side. So Ian Hislop, did I pronounce correct? Hislop. In Greece, it's like a Greek star. We'll call it hydro, for example. Okay, with water. Okay, you have 9 minutes.
Okay, I'll try and keep it to 9 minutes. I can't promise anything. No, I'll try. Yeah, I know, yeah. Right. Yes, good. Okay, so the New Zealand experience of the pandemic, the pandemic came late to the New Zealand context, and of course, one of the advantages of living far away from everybody else is that good things take a while to get there, but so do bad things. And we were witnessing the lines of coffins in New York, or the death in Italy, people singing in defiance on the balconies in Florence, and all that generated a significant amount of fear and preparedness. The pandemic, the effects, I think, short term and long term, are very mixed politically and sociologically. We had a centre left government took a very strict virus elimination policy. We saw unprecedented regulation, series of lengthy lockdowns, travel restrictions, compulsory mask wearing, enforced vaccinations, compulsory vaccinations for people in certain professions like teaching, for example. Border controls, returning nationals had to stay in quarantine hotels. Very unprecedented regulation. And there was also, initially the whole thing was a novelty, I think, the lockdown experience. In some ways it was, you know, it was, people had the opportunity to reevaluate the daily grind, the priorities of life, more family time. The whole world kind of slowed down a little bit, which was pleasant on some levels. People thought a little bit about how we live and why we live the way we live. The animals, I think, were quite relieved to have all these two-legged beasts on the back foot for a little while. So bird life came back and all that sort of stuff. But there were, as I said, mixed effects. It also highlighted social inequalities. You know, the poor always suffer the most, right? On national television, we had the kind of interesting bourgeois kind of response of, you know, we had one of the executives, I think, in one of the national television companies took on his family came on after the news. They canned this after it went on for a couple of weeks. Big sort of designer kitchen and new recipes, you know, and how you're going to amuse your children with more electronic devices and you know, and all this sort of stuff. And of course, all that sort of diversionary, avoiding boredom strategies was silly when so many people were suffering, poorer people were suffering and didn't have the resources to manage lockdown. So as time went by, frustrations grew, and we had this strange coalition of opposition interests, and that led to big protests. And Parliament grounds were occupied by 1,000 people in early 2002. There was a big, clumsy, messy occupation. Eventually got broken down and disrupted by the police. So socially, New Zealand, you know, it's 5 million people at the bottom of the world. It's a British colony, long tradition of liberal, conservative, centre-right politics, farmers and business interests, market freedom, or at least protected market freedom. And a whole mixture of groups became concerned with the expansion of state intervention during the pandemic. It's kind of interesting sociologically and politically because of the unusual coalition of groups. So you had old hippies, you know, alternative lifestyle people with house trucks and things, you know, suspicious of the pharmaceutical industry, suspicious of vaccinations, suspicious of the big state, farmers and business interests concerned with excessive state regulation that wasn't in their interests, promoting freedom of choice, the religious Christian right, evangelical churches very strong on being worried about state interference. In the rural areas and small towns who were kind of left behind a little bit during the neoliberal revolution of the 90s into the 2000s, feelings of disenfranchisement, mistrust of urban liberal intelligentsia, mistrust of the liberal state. And much of that was embodied by our articulate liberal Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, who was a popular international figure and became increasingly unpopular at home, and generated a lot of misogyny. And also much of the opposition was manipulated by a small far right political movement. So counter-spin organization, sort of reminiscent or similar to the Trump phenomenon in the US, right? Growth in conspiracy theories, misinformation, disinformation, a lot of populist platforms and social media. And that all sort of culminated in the strange occupation of Parliament grounds. The idea of freedom somehow connected to hyper-nationalism. So freedom, the idea of freedom, sorry, hyper-nationalism, you know, so human freedom somehow moving towards a fascist position politically. And so very strong political polarization, again, a bit like the US. And also the political left being so fragmented. Not a lot of coherent opposition from the political left, which was also interesting and worrying. So, you know, this big protest thing it didn't really have widespread support. It was broken up by the police, but it was symptomatic, I think, of some of the social divisions and some of the unraveling of political certainties that we've seen, I guess, in the last decade or so. And I understand, you know, the same situation with Europe, the rise of the political right. And people whose interests really aren't served by that brand of politics being drawn to the ideology somehow. So, you know, we live in really challenging times, don't we? The pandemic and the story of the pandemic is interwoven with the climate crisis, concern about sustainability of our economic models, economic insecurity, and at some level a rethinking of how and why we live as we do, whose interests are served by the way that our societies are organized. So it's an interesting mix. Was it the Indian thinker and novelist Arundhati Roy about the pandemic as a portal, as a pathway or beginnings of a new way of thinking about things. I think that feeling of hope probably still exists, but as we continue to fragment politically, as our old certainties around the political left and right become less clear, as people become perhaps more desperate, there's also a feeling of chaos, of uncertainty. And I'm not sure how we find our way through that. And some of this, I think, is perhaps the unresolved legacy of the pandemic, trying to understand and comprehend and rebuild some sense of certainty and solidarity here for each other.
Stepped down, and now I'm going to ask you, what is the salary of the Prime Minister in New Zealand, because he got just an appointment at Harvard University. I want to compare salaries. That's the reason that she stepped down, I think. No. Anyway, but I want to still, as an economist, see what was the opportunity cost of being Prime Minister now that she's a professor at Harvard, a special one. No, she got the job now. Oh yeah, she got the job. She's professor at Harvard. She was on. Okay, our next speaker is again from the United States. I mean, how many people we have from the United States? 1, 2. Not too many. 2, no, 3, I think, 3. But the other one is Greek. I mean, counts half and half. John Davison from Health Inequality. Now, speaking about names, I should say something, but I'll say it after your presentation. More representatives.
So And during the pandemic, most of my work revolved around farm workers. So we have migrant farm workers that come in Mexico. And so that's somewhat what I'm going to share. But I like this quote from our vice president who said, there is no vaccine for racism. So when we talk about COVID-19 being novel, you would expect the most vulnerable people, the elderly, those immunocompromised, et cetera, would be the most at risk, which basically has been true. But what we've also seen in the United States is that COVID-19 affected race and ethnicity much more than other populations. So when you look at the mortality rate at deaths per 100,000 by race and ethnicity, indigenous people, which we term Native Americans, Black were one of the highest groups that died from COVID-19, followed by Pacific Islanders, followed by Latino, followed by white, and then the lowest actually was Asian. In North Carolina, when our governor, so first the president signed an executive emergency order that helped us get ready for the pandemic. It also allowed us to telehealth and some of the other things that we weren't able to do before. It helped with the vaccinations, et cetera. And in North Carolina, it was shown right at the beginning, COVID-19 disproportionately affected communities of color for several reasons, including existing social, environmental, and health inequities. Despite making up 22% of North Carolina's population as of June 1st, African Americans accounted for 30% of the confirmed COVID-19 cases and 34% of COVID-19 deaths in cases where race is unknown. Similarly, Hispanics accounted for 39% of confirmed COVID-19 cases, in cases, again, where we knew race or ethnicity, despite only making up 10% of the population in North Carolina. So again, one of the highest populations that were affected in North Carolina were the Hispanic, and yet they only made up 10% of the population. We know that a lot of that has to do with they are and were the essential workers out there continuing to work. Also low literacy, low income, and also had many barriers such as lack of health insurance, inability to become insured, lack of access to health care, lack of child care, so they couldn't stay home. They also had, if they lost work, they lost wages. So even when they were symptomatic, like when we were doing telehealth, they didn't want to report symptoms because that meant they couldn't work, which meant that they could not have income.
They also needed to work to pay for basic things like food, rent, utilities. Many of us could stay home and work from home and work distantly, but they could not. So they also have no rights to unemployment compensation, no paid sick leave. And also they live in very crowded housing and unsanitary housing and risk losing housing due to job loss. So with stress, anxiety, lack of mental, the uncertainty surrounding many farm workers in particular refused to even say when they were sick, and they didn't want to have to be put into isolation or quarantine because that meant lost wages, lost work. And so it was, COVID would spread rapidly. This shows adjusted for age, other racial groups as many times more likely to have died in COVID-19 than white Americans. Now, this is from statistic from 2021. So again, if you're white, if you're Asian, you're one. If you're Black, you're 2 times as likely to have died from COVID-19. If you were Latino, you 2.4 times as likely to die. And if you were Pacific Islander, 2.6 times likely to die. And also that was true with vaccine updates. Again, Hispanic and sometimes undocumented are afraid to go for any sort of public assistance, even when we were giving vaccines for free, tests for free, etc., because they're just not part of the healthcare system and they're afraid to become a part of it. So the most likely to be vaccinated in the US was Asian, followed by white, followed by indigenous, followed by Latino, followed by Black. Again, lack of trust of the healthcare system. So how can we remedy? What can we learn from COVID? Part of it, again, we really have to think in terms of health is just not about what you do or don't do. Health really has this overtone of racism to it, and cultural understanding and linguistical understanding is really important in order to provide effective, equitable, understandable, and respectful quality care and services that are responsive to diverse cultural health beliefs and practices, preferred languages, health literacy, and other communication. We do have an Office of Minority Health that should be training all healthcare providers. Again, we started out doing telehealth to the farm workers, and we used WhatsApp because it was an app that they could communicate with. But again, even trying to advise them to go seek care, many times they were afraid to report it, and typically by the time they did seek care, they were severely critical. Other strategies that we've implemented, Setson, that we've learned is to screen and test right at the very beginning to offer vaccine boosters when they come into our state. We also provide information on washing your hands. We give away free masks, hand sanitizers. We've learned to work with the growers and the farm workers organization to help promote vaccination. We've worked on policies around allowing paid time off and isolation housing that should be provided to all sick farm workers, and policies should be in place for enforcement. So again, even to this day, just last week, we were doing a vaccine clinic working with the Latino, Hispanic, in trying to provide culturally appropriate care, trying to train our healthcare workers around the need for understanding culture and the need to build trust. And so it's really important to have people that speak the language and also people that they will trust.
Presentation well prepared. Our next speaker has the right name. I can pronounce it. I mean, Philippos Kandilis. Correct. You see, that's a name, Ian. I mean, what do you mean? I was teaching in Toronto. That's the joke now. I was teaching in Toronto, and something happened at the university, and then the policeman came. It was a tall guy, Scottish, you know. So had nothing to do with race, what I'm going to say. He was a nice guy. He was very tall, and he said, "Sir, can you? What's your name?" I say, "Sir, my name is Gregory Papanikos." Went like that. Said, "Can you spell it?" He went like that. Not in disapproval, but he had to write down my name, so he found it difficult. And I said, "Okay, I'll spell it to you." So P as in Peter, I spell my name. "Sir," I said, "yeah. What is your name?" "My name is Adam Smith," said. Adam. I say, "Can you spell it for me, please? It's a very common English name." He said, "My name is very common." I said, "But you didn't know it." And he spelled it. So you say, "Yes, sir, yeah, yes." So, after the Greek time. Oh,
Talk a bit about this model. Describes how the psychiatric community is thinking about what we've been experiencing in the last, call it moral injury. You may be familiar with it. This is my hospital in Washington, big psychiatric hospital, public hospital in a city that's a black city, black leadership, particularly sensitive. Just so you know, we come to this legitimately. We've been here a while. We work with universities on outcome studies. Just so the context is that this is the world's problem. It's just that the United States, with all of its forces, badly at it, both in terms of resources that we're spreading across the country, the world, and in terms of our hesitancy, our stance, especially under the previous. The reason we think that moral injury is important is that we don't want to die. Lots of trauma coming out of what everyone's been. Funny. You don't want to say, you've got PTSD, ill person, you don't have depression. We might talk about it in terms of emotional exhaustion and burnout, right? But as you may know, the controversy is there that there's some overlap with depression. And we want to be very careful with the burnout. But we're trying to talk more about this idea of moral injury. And just so you can tell, again, the context. Suicide has always been a problem in the US, certainly globally as well, and our physician burnout rates are astronomical. And in terms of context, in terms of previous vaccination sequences and other pandemics, there's been a ton of hesitancy. It's just that we've done better than most in the past. Still, and here are some of the strategies. So if you deal with people from the community, if you want to improve vaccination rates, you need to talk to community centers. You need to talk to family. That's some of the kinds of things. Organizational stress, the hospitals, obviously. Nurses, losing physicians, people sick out for weeks at a time, and then long COVID. So that took forever. And then we learned that empirical studies that actually mandates improve outcomes. So the cities that were more aggressive had fewer deaths. And this has been true going back a century in the US. So there are cities, you can tell that the ones who were more conservative with more quarantines
and more isolation. And this was bad news. Again, we matched national distress rates of our guns in the United States. So by the time it hit, we were purchasing or drinking like crazy. And youth suicide, which initially was flat, started seeing in the bellwether community color of Hispanic girls. What we have adapted institutionally, because I work at a hospital, is this idea of empathic firmness, which is actually the idea of saying, yes, we get it. We know that you don't like mandates. We know that you don't like vaccinations. But we're very sorry, but this is something we have to. I sit on the APA ethics committee, and we do international webinars. How do you balance your own and your family's risks against the risks of patients? Weren't altogether great about how to quarantine people. At my hospital, we have the CDC, our National Public Health Office, come by twice to help us figure out how to move patients at risk. But we tried to say that this is a matter of public, right? So you may try to balance personal and professional ethics, but it's a matter of. So we come to this idea that comes from a number of different sources. This is Jonathan Shea's famous book, you know, that massive academic military out of we changed the way of medicine, but it goes back to the Iliad. It's this sense of betrayal, not being able to sell for your community, for your own family, and even for yourself, because we have ventilators, we and psychiatrists were pulled into the medical community to have training, had to come out opinions how to use psychiatrists. So this is an agency, moral agency. The institution, the government. I think that this is address people's hesitancy. At the same time, we try to come powerful. No, he fond of older people, so he thickest and the youngest at the same time. But these were the kinds of and these are, again, these are the lessons from us. This is our old hospital, 150. But it became a community project. So shared decision making, being able to talk with the nurses, being able to talk with mental health workers, the people that we had to hire, the travel folks, locums, and making sure that we had constant updates. Teaching resilience, which again, with short-term kind of psychological first aid efforts that there are, and the longer-term counseling for psychological help. And then, of course, we discharged as many patients as we could. So this was wonderful for the families and the patients. It was a little concerning for us. We weren't sure how that would come out, but we did quite well with our outcomes in the community. We identified quarantine spaces, never had them before. Trying to come up with schedules, backup plans for people. Mandatory testing, travel, domestic. These are all the kinds of all been going through. But so I'll leave you with that. The old.
Michael Adams, Adamopoulos is his name. It's a Greek one. That's very easy. And he's from Australia, another oceanic accent here.
Well, hasn't it been a fascinating discovery, the different disciplines, different jurisdictions, our experiences? And I've been hit already, not in my speaking notes, the impact was different for different people. At that point, particularly Ian, coming from the Southern Hemisphere. So my presentation is entitled How Australia Returned to a New Normal for Law Schools with a strong familiarity with the old normal. Let me unpack this a little bit. Looking at the average age of us folk, there are some exceptions, smiling to the lady at the back. We all remember the year 2000, the millennium bug, where we thought the world was going to come crashing down. Well, I was lucky enough to be in London and flying back on Christmas Eve, or before that. My wife, who is here, wanted to kill me because I'd been traveling a lot that year, and the idea of me falling out of a plane when we had two young children was not a great idea. I actually ended up in Egypt. That's a whole other story, maybe for tonight. However, what we do know about the millennium bug, and I think we have to run parallels here, is that governments and corporations invested heavily in technology. It was the biggest jump. Of course, they then didn't spend anything for the next 10 years, but at that point, they really moved forward. Hence my reference to the old and the new, and actually thinking, are there lessons? And everything that's been said, particularly from the healthcare perspective, not mine. It's like, wow, are we going to learn from this? Are we actually going to invest in the right places and share information? So in Australia, very much like Ian's comments around New Zealand, I think, and hindsight is a wonderful thing, that we were very slow, except the pandemic. In fact, we as an island, again, like New Zealand, take our biodiversity and our biosecurity incredibly seriously. Such a huge nation, but if something goes wrong, damage is way beyond. We can't isolate in the same way we saw in Europe. So we were also watching the television, watching New York coffins, London coffins, Milan coffins, and thinking, wow, that's a long way from where we are. However, I've done over 20 trips to China in the last 15 years and have a number of friends and work with Chinese universities, and wasn't hearing very much from them, which obviously reflects the climate that there was no follow through. Also, Australia politically, relatively naively, decided to be one of the countries to push to hold China responsible, particularly in Wuhan, as the beginning of the virus, whether it was from bats or any other animal or a lab, still completely unknown, because obviously any country that operates like that's going to destroy all evidence. However, for some reason, and I'm, by the way, not taking a political stance, our Prime Minister decided to lead the charge with other nations. But our biggest trading partner was China. They cut out $200 billion of trade instantly. And those repercussions, we've just had a change of federal government, are starting to slowly thaw that relationship. However, Taiwan is not very far away from us, so we are watching that. And of course, you may be aware, Australia has entered into nuclear. We are a non-nuclear country, part of AUKUS, United Kingdom and they to use nuclear subsidies. So for us, this is a politically hot potato. So after that slow move, we then went, again, just like New Zealand, the incredible lockdowns. Melbourne has the equal world record for the longest lockdown, and the mental health issues that have flowed from that particular. The other thing that's a little bit unusual about Australia, and probably more close to the US, is that we have a federal parliament, national laws on a prime minister, and then we have state laws and state governments and state parliaments. And at this point in time, in this exact point in time, and it's only happened a few times in history, all the same political party, a left-leaning Labour Party, is actually in power. But during the pandemic, the federal government was more right-wing, and New South Wales, the most populous, the most richest state, in fact, where we live, was also right-wing. But Victoria, to our south, the next biggest place, so Melbourne and Sydney, was Labor. Queensland, to the north of us, Labor. And to the west of us in Western Australia, Labor. Well, all of a sudden, for the first time, I'm somebody who was born in England, but has lived with my wife in Australia for 35 years, and think of myself as Australian, as in that's who I am. I may support New South Wales in sport, but all of a sudden, we hear from the Queensland Premier, somebody cannot cross the border into Queensland to go to a hospital, which is only 100 kilometres, rather than the 700 kilometres to go to Sydney. And children died crossing a border that's an artificial line because of politics. And that broke my heart. How, and in fact, the High Court has had some, which is our US Supreme Court equivalent, challenges to the law, how that allowed to happen. Australia is a very, ironically, compliant country. When I was looking at the vaccination rates, we were in the 95 to 98% of all population. Our Indigenous folk did get hit the hardest, but we put greater quarantine around communities so that people could travel in and out. But in terms of vaccination, the general population across all cultures was incredibly high, and the government, in that sense, did a good job. But there was a constant fighting between a federal government and state governments, sadly, mostly around political lines. Hindsight does, and I think hindsight does provide some perspective in the sense of, I honestly believe, that our political leaders, to the best of their abilities and knowledge, actually believe their communities, what they were doing was the right thing. I mean, I think the beauty of hindsight is we now know around the world, the experiments in like Sweden and Norway actually had no better results than countries that did huge lockdowns, etc. Like the research is still going on, but it's actually of a real mixed bag. So that in itself is quite interesting. But that interplay between difficult political decisions and how things were played out, was only open the doors. Now let me get to my 2 minutes left, sort of a speedy reflection of what's now happening. So in 2022, at a university, at a law school, we started returning to campus. Australia has 40 law schools, and everybody wanted to return to campus in that sense. The law societies and admitting authorities, the overseers in that sense, allowed online examinations and real flexibility. And all of a sudden, they're starting to wind back to everything that's sold. Some of the new challenges on this new normal come back to shaking hands. And there's a whole bunch of good medical reasons why probably we shouldn't do that. There's something about the humanness that wants to return to those old ways. I've noticed a growth in things in my area like greenwash, whereby people are selling environmental brands. All of a sudden, we're more concerned about the environment, and I'm not, by the way, saying a good or bad thing, than we are about public health. That was yesterday. We're going to focus on new things. Generative AI is a huge area. So the ChatGPTs and equivalents and the impact of that. That's our number one worry at the university, the way students cheat. There is a gap, I think, between law schools and business schools. And by business schools, I do mean finance, management, accounting, and economics. That seems to be getting wider than closer. Because my area is corporate law and corporate governance, I've always seen an overlap in those areas. But I'm noticing, even at this conference, we're widening our perspective and not listening to each other. So whether it be in research methodologies, whether it would be in outcomes, and we're not reaching out. Isn't the lesson of the pandemic that all disciplines contribute to a better outcome, faster decision making, need those different points to be heard? But the last thing I hope to share with you is a little story about the beauties of drafting on the run. During the pandemic, laws were passed with lightning speed, of course, a miracle in its own right. But those laws weren't passed by Parliament in a normal way. There was no debate. The Minister of Health was given delegated legislation. They wrote those laws after midnight. We have two daughters. One was in hospital in radiation, and one is a lawyer who works for an American law. The lawyer and I would talk about the particular regulations because most of the community was running around going, oh, we can't do this, we can't do that, we can't. Can you believe most people didn't bother to read the laws? Australia is a very open country. Everything is published online. Lucy and I would actually pull it up on screen, look at it, and you could drive a truck through those laws. What do I mean by that? Every fine that was issued for somebody having a cup of coffee in a public park when they should have been home, every single fine has been thrown out by the judiciary. The government has received zero criminal funds for those 2 years of hell that was imposed. Why? Because the laws were not drafted before. Simple as that. Drafting 101 went out the window when you're tired and you do it at midnight. And I said, what was interesting, father and daughter used to just laugh at the drafting of the laws, the way we do public health. It is all smoke. Thank you.
Our next speaker is from Finland, Seppo Putanen. Did I say it correct? Putanen. Putanen. Okay.
My self-regulation is the best one. Yeah, kind of talk about the whole specialized in certain work. I cannot resist the. Go back to Jan's presentation a bit. Longest distance from Finland is Finland. Around Finland and Finland are exactly opposite sides. Yeah, and there's interesting similarities between New Zealand. Yeah. But concerning the COVID era, the similarities like so Finland was led through the crisis by social democratic government that was led by a young charismatic prime minister who became kind of superstar in global stage. And she just lost. Yeah, she of course a victim of misogyny and things like that, but he just lost election to the far right conservative parties, so we have government. Well, the population is about anyway, my subject is about changes in working life or the balance related to work life in Finland in relation to this COVID pandemic era. Because Finland is also kind of world meaning that platforms to like, starting from emails, platforms that we work with. Generally, in Finland, they have and when the pandemic hit, there were kind of strong measures by government. For example, one county was declared a state of emergency. It was cut off from the rest of the country. Move between one county and the most populous county in Finland, the southern Finland, you went quite radical. But it lasted for about. Now, of course, there was the enforced movement or displacement from work at workplaces, offices to work as far as it was possible in the workforce. Finland is kind of wage work-based society compared to many other societies. Strong wage work-based society. So we were interested what happened when the remote work kind of law, and so made a survey in this one of our research projects. We made a survey to the whole targeted to the whole population that was belonged to the workforce, whole Finland. It was kind of, because I have some emphasis on gender. That survey that was pretty successful in the traditional statistical way, relatively good. And we had 100 and it was pretty kind of well tentatively generalized into the population. And we were interested in kind of one or two of the things we were interested in. It happened to surveillance of work. Did employers, they want surveillance or supervise the people, the employees more, workers when they went home as far as possible. Some kind of trust or some increasement in utilized like time cards or kind of snapshot on work or utilized forms of supervision and surveillance. And the other thing was that the kind of deterioration of trust employers. But the results were that quite surprising that there was, you asked about workers and employers' experience. Employers. They said that the most general picture was that no, that there's supervision surveillance at all. Didn't happen anything. And if we hold the big parts of workforce far as it is possible, of course, all sectors of work go to remote. Yeah, transport, things like that. But the major part of those sectors in the workforce were able to do
of the indicators that they have been in the last months, I have felt nervous and distressed, and they have been upset because of something wrong happened, and also they have not been outside of their control. They can't do anything against this one. And another indicator was that they have felt unable to control the important things during their daily life. The second project that we have did also was the psychological defense mechanism among Palestinians during the pandemic. And it was also Palestinians have been used a high level of defense mechanism, and the majority of it was the finding used the DNA was the first defense mechanism, then the rationalization and the projection, and also Palestinian used the regression and the sublimation as a defense mechanism in order to fix this issue. And the crime thing I have to share with you that we have Israelis have sold us a lot of expired vaccination. It was a very crime against the Palestinians, and we discovered this. And this makes the thing worse. And the third project was about the Palestinian attitude and the preferences about the vaccination. And we have worked a lot in order to convey the people and to encourage them to do the vaccination. And unfortunately,
Any other comment, question? Yes. Just identify yourself, so because we have 3 different small, so people know. South Africa is going to pull out of this. So that's so easy. It's so easy. I mean, things are very easy. I mean, yeah, they're going to pull out, and that's fine. If something does not serve you, you pull out. Okay. Okay. For me? I thought someone will ask me. I mean, I feel I have this syndrome of. In the European Union, we had a policy. Yeah. Yeah. I take it from. I think you can respond about the European Union. Did you understand the question? I'm going to repeat the question. No, that's why I asked Professor Fregel asked the question because some people maybe didn't understand. How did different countries cope with the pandemic's effect on employment? Because a lot of people not lost their employment, but they were like ourselves here. We have 15 people working. We stopped. So what happened? I mean, in the European Union, we know what happened. But anyway, Professor Hughes. Yeah, you can talk for all European Union. You're an autocrat. I mean, you how did Russia cope with this? In Europe, because the European Union supported, if someone did not work, the government paid his salary, part of his salary. That was a European initiative.